Tariffs and supply chains, what's true and what's not. Consumers always pay for tariffs. Introduction. Tariffs, taxes imposed on imported goods, are often at the center of economic policy debates, particularly regarding their impact on supply chains, businesses, and consumers. A common narrative is that consumers always pay for tariffs due to the increased costs of imported goods, which are passed on through higher retail prices. However, the reality is more nuanced. While consumers often bear a significant portion of tariff costs, companies can and do absorb some of these costs in certain scenarios, depending on market dynamics, competition, and strategic decisions. This article explores the interplay between tariffs and supply chains, critically examining the claim that consumers always pay for tariffs and highlighting cases where companies absorb costs. By analyzing economic principles, real-world examples, and recent studies, we aim to separate fact from fiction in this complex economic landscape. Understanding tariffs and their role in supply chains. Tariffs are levies imposed by governments on imported goods, typically to protect domestic industries, raise revenue, or address trade imbalances. They increase the cost of imported goods, which can ripple through global supply chains, affecting manufacturers, retailers, and consumers. Supply chains, the interconnected networks of production, distribution, and sales, are highly sensitive to cost changes. When tariffs are applied, they can disrupt these networks by increasing input costs, altering sourcing strategies, and prompting businesses to reconfigure their operations. The assumption that consumers always pay for tariffs stems from the idea of pass-through, where businesses raise prices to offset the additional costs of tariffs. However, pass-through is not automatic or universal. The extent to which tariff costs are passed on to consumers depends on factors such as market competition, demand elasticity, profit margins, and the ability to reconfigure supply chains. In some cases, companies absorb tariff costs to maintain market share, protect consumer demand, or avoid long-term losses, challenging the notion that consumers bear the full burden. Economic theory: who pays for tariffs? To understand when and why companies might absorb tariff costs, we must first examine the economic principles governing tariff incidence, the distribution of the tax burden between producers, importers, and consumers. Price elasticity of demand and supply. Price elasticity measures how sensitive demand or supply is to price changes. When demand for a product is inelastic, e.g., essential goods like medicine, consumers are less likely to reduce purchases even if prices rise, making it easier for companies to pass on tariff costs. Conversely, when demand is elastic, e.g., luxury goods or products with many substitutes, consumers may reduce purchases or switch to alternatives if prices increase, incentivizing companies to absorb costs to maintain sales. Similarly, the elasticity of supply affects whether foreign producers lower their prices to offset tariffs, reducing the burden on importers and consumers. Market structure and competition. In highly competitive markets, companies face pressure to keep prices stable to avoid losing market share. If a company raises prices to cover tariffs, competitors sourcing from untariffed regions or producing domestically may gain an advantage. This dynamic encourages companies to absorb some or all tariff costs, especially in industries with low profit margins, such as retail or consumer electronics. Profit margins and cost absorption. Companies with higher profit margins have more flexibility to absorb tariff costs without raising prices. For example, a firm with a 20% profit margin on a product can absorb a 10% tariff by reducing its margin, whereas a firm with a 3% margin, common in retail, may have little choice but to pass costs on or seek alternative strategies, such as sourcing from lower-cost suppliers. Pass-through rates. Economic studies suggest that pass-through rates, the percentage of tariff costs passed on to consumers, vary widely. A 2019 study by economists Pablo Fagelbaum and colleagues found that U.S. tariffs imposed in 2018 to 2019 had nearly complete pass-through to U.S. firms and consumers for many goods, but foreign exporters absorbed some costs for specific products, such as steel, where pass-through fell to 50% after a year. Another study by Alberto Cavallo in 2019 noted that while tariffs on Chinese imports were largely passed through to import prices, only a portion reached retail consumers, indicating that businesses absorbed some costs to maintain competitive pricing. Cases where companies absorb tariff costs. While consumers often face higher prices due to tariffs, there are documented cases where companies absorb costs, either partially or fully, to mitigate the impact on demand or maintain competitiveness. Below, we explore real-world examples and scenarios where this occurs. Tesla's response to Canadian tariffs. In 2025, when Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods in response to U.S. tariffs, Tesla absorbed a portion of the cost increase for its electric vehicles sold in Canada. Raising prices to fully cover the tariffs would have reduced demand in a price-sensitive market, especially given competition from other electric vehicle manufacturers like BYD, which faced lower or no tariffs. By absorbing some costs, Tesla maintained its market share in Canada, prioritizing long-term customer loyalty over short-term profit margins. This strategy was feasible due to Tesla's relatively high profit margins on its vehicles, which allowed it to offset tariff costs without significant financial strain. Case 2, Walmart's strategic cost absorption. Walmart, the largest private employer in the U.S., operates on thin profit margins, 3 to 4%, and relies heavily on imported goods, particularly from China. In response to the 2018 to 2019 U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports, Walmart absorbed a portion of the tariff costs for certain products to avoid steep price increases that could drive customers to competitors like Target or Amazon. For example, Walmart negotiated with suppliers to lower costs and optimized its supply chain by sourcing from alternative countries like Vietnam, where tariffs were lower. However, Walmart did raise prices on some goods by up to 51% when absorption was not feasible, illustrating a mixed strategy of cost absorption and pass-through. Case 3, Apple's supply chain diversification. During the 2018 U.S.-China trade war, Apple faced tariffs on components and products manufactured in China. Rather than passing the full cost to consumers, Apple diversified its supply chain by expanding production to Vietnam and India, where tariffs were lower or non-existent. This move reduced the overall tariff burden, allowing Apple to absorb some costs and maintain stable prices for products like iPhones and MacBooks. Apple's high profit margins and global supply chain flexibility enabled it to mitigate tariff impacts without significantly raising consumer prices. Additionally, Apple renegotiated contracts with suppliers to share the cost burden, further reducing the need for price hikes. Case 4, Small businesses and pre-tariff inventory stockpiling. Small businesses with limited profit margins often face challenges absorbing tariff costs, but some mitigate the impact through strategic planning. For example, FreeWrite, a US-based manufacturer of digital typewriters, warned customers in 2025 about impending price hikes due to tariffs on its China-made products. To delay these increases, FreeWrite stockpiled inventory at pre-tariff prices, absorbing the cost of storage and financing to maintain stable prices for as long as possible. This strategy allowed FreeWrite to cushion the immediate impact on consumers, though it acknowledged that long-term price increases were likely unavoidable without significant supply chain reconfiguration. Case 5, Steel and Aluminum Industries. In the case of U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum imposed in 2018, foreign exporters, particularly from the EU, South Korea, and Japan, lowered their prices to absorb some of the tariff costs, reducing the pass-through to U.S. firms and consumers. A study by economists Mary Amidi and colleagues found that while initial pass-through was nearly 100%, it dropped to 50% for steel after a year as foreign suppliers adjusted prices to remain competitive. This cost absorption by foreign exporters helped U.S. manufacturers and downstream industries, such as automotive and construction, avoid some of the price increases, though consumers still faced higher costs for certain finished goods. Strategies companies use to absorb tariff costs. Companies employ various strategies to absorb or mitigate tariff costs, avoiding immediate price increases for consumers. These strategies include: 1. Supply chain diversification. As seen with Apple, companies can shift production to countries with lower or no tariffs, such as Vietnam, India, or Mexico. This friendshoring or nearshoring reduces tariff exposure but requires significant investment in new facilities, supplier relationships, and quality control. For example, Learning Resources, a U.S. toy manufacturer, moved 16% of its production from China to Vietnam and India in 2025 to avoid high tariffs on Chinese imports, reducing the need to pass costs to consumers. 2. Supplier negotiations. Companies often renegotiate contracts with suppliers to share the tariff burden. By leveraging long-term relationships or bulk purchasing power, firms like Walmart convince suppliers to lower prices, offsetting tariff costs. This strategy is particularly effective in competitive supplier markets where producers are incentivized to maintain export volumes. 3. Inventory stockpiling. As demonstrated by Freeride, companies can pre-order goods at pre-tariff prices to build inventory, delaying the need to raise prices. This approach requires sufficient cash flow and storage capacity but can provide short-term relief from tariff impacts. In Q4 2024 and early 2025, many U.S. companies stockpiled materials to mitigate the effects of anticipated tariffs. 4. Cost optimization and efficiency. Businesses can absorb tariff costs by improving operational efficiencies, such as streamlining logistics, reducing waste, or adopting automation. For instance, large companies like PepsiCo, facing tariff-related cost increases in 2025, invested in supply chain optimization to offset some costs, though they still warned of potential price increases if efficiencies were insufficient. 5. Margin compression. Companies with higher profit margins can reduce their margins to absorb tariff costs. This is common in industries like technology or automotive, where firms like Tesla or Apple prioritize market share and brand loyalty over short-term profitability. However, this strategy is less viable for low-margin industries like automotive, where firms like Tesla or Apple prioritize market share and brand loyalty over short-term profitability. However, this strategy is less viable for low-margin industries like retail, where companies like Walmart have limited room to compress margins further. 6. Product redesign or substitution. Some companies redesign products to use untariffed materials or components, reducing costs. For example, a furniture manufacturer might switch from imported steel to domestically sourced aluminum to avoid tariffs, maintaining stable prices for consumers. This approach requires investment in research and development but can be a long-term solution to tariff challenges. When consumers bear the burden. Despite these strategies, consumers often end up paying a portion of tariff costs, especially in the following scenarios. 1. Inelastic demand. For goods with inelastic demand, such as essential medicines or unique products with few substitutes, companies can pass on tariff costs with minimal impact on sales. For example, tariffs on imported pharmaceuticals often lead to higher consumer prices because patients have limited alternatives. 2. Limited competition. In markets with few competitors, companies face less pressure to absorb costs. For instance, tariffs on specialized industrial equipment with few global suppliers are likely to result in higher prices for businesses and, ultimately, consumers. 3. Complex supply chains. When tariffs affect intermediate goods, e.g., steel or semiconductors, the cost increase compounds through the supply chain, making it harder for companies to absorb costs. A 2019 study found that tariffs on washing machines led to a 12% price increase for both imported and domestic models, as well as dryers, which were not tariffed, due to interconnected supply chain costs. Consumers bore the brunt of these increases, paying $1.5 billion more for 1,800 additional jobs, a cost of $815,000 per job created. 4. Retaliatory tariffs. When trading partners impose retaliatory tariffs, as seen with Canada, China, and the EU in response to U.S. tariffs, export industries like U.S. agriculture face higher costs, reducing supply and increasing prices for consumers globally. These ripple effects make it harder for companies to absorb costs without impacting prices. The broader impact of tariffs on supply chains. Tariffs disrupt global supply chains in several ways, influencing whether companies absorb costs or pass them on. 1. Increased costs and inflation. Tariffs raise the cost of imported goods, contributing to inflation. J.P. Morgan estimated in 2025 that new U.S. tariffs could increase personal consumption expenditures, PCE, prices by 1 to 1.5%, reducing real disposable income and consumer spending. While companies may absorb some costs initially, sustained tariffs often lead to price increases as absorption becomes unsustainable. 2. Supply chain reconfiguration. Tariffs prompt companies to reconfigure supply chains, often at significant cost. Moving production to new countries, as seen with Apple and Learning Resources, involves vetting new suppliers, ensuring quality, and managing logistical complexities. These costs can offset the benefits of avoiding tariffs, and smaller companies with limited resources may struggle to adapt, leading to higher prices for consumers. 3. Economic uncertainty. Tariff announcements increase economic policy uncertainty, causing companies to delay investments and hiring. The Economic Policy Uncertainty Index doubled in early 2025 due to Trump's tariff policies, reducing investment by an estimated 4.4%. This uncertainty encourages companies to pass costs to consumers to protect short-term profitability, though some opt to absorb costs to maintain long-term stability. 4. Retaliatory trade wars. Retaliatory tariffs from trading partners, such as China's 84% tariffs on U.S. goods in 2025, exacerbate supply chain disruptions. These measures increase costs for U.S. exporters, reducing supply and driving up prices for consumers globally. Companies may absorb some costs to remain competitive, but prolonged trade wars often lead to higher consumer prices. Myths and realities, debunking common tariff misconceptions. Consumers always pay the full cost of tariffs. Reality: while consumers often bear a significant portion of tariff costs, companies and foreign suppliers can absorb costs through lower margins, price negotiations, or supply chain adjustments. Studies show that pass-through rates vary, with foreign exporters absorbing up to 50% of tariff costs in some cases, such as steel. Tariffs always boost domestic production. Reality: tariffs aim to protect domestic industries, but they don't always lead to increased production. High costs and limited domestic capacity, as seen in industries like solar panels and electric vehicles, can prevent reshoring. Instead, companies may shift production to other foreign countries with lower tariffs, as evidenced by the CNBC Supply Chain Survey, where 61% of respondents plan to relocate to low-tariff regimes rather than the U.S. Tariffs are a simple fix for trade imbalances. Reality: tariffs can reduce imports but often fail to address trade deficits comprehensively. The U.S. trade deficit persists due to reliance on imported inputs for exports, and tariffs can increase costs for domestic manufacturers, reducing competitiveness. A 2024 study by Panos Kavelas found that tariffs on components slowed reshoring in industries like bicycles due to cost disadvantages. Tariffs have no long-term consequences. Reality: tariffs disrupt supply chains, increase costs, and reduce consumer choice, with long-term effects on economic growth. The Penn-Wharton budget model projected that 2025 tariffs would reduce U.S. GDP by 8% and wages by 7%, with a $58,000 lifetime loss per middle-income household. Policy implications and recommendations. To balance the goals of protecting domestic industries and minimizing consumer harm, policymakers and businesses can consider the following. 1. Targeted tariffs. Rather than broad tariffs, target specific industries with strategic importance, such as semiconductors or clean energy, to minimize disruption to consumer goods. Combine tariffs with tax credits or subsidies to encourage domestic production, as seen with EV tax credits. 2. Supply chain resilience. Businesses should invest in supply chain visibility and scenario planning, using AI-driven tools to model tariff impacts and identify alternative suppliers. Platforms like Project 44 and Kinaxis help companies anticipate disruptions and adapt quickly. 3. Consumer protections. Policymakers can mitigate tariff impacts on consumers through tax relief or subsidies for essential goods. Progressive taxation can offset the regressive nature of tariffs, which disproportionately affect lower-income households. 4. International cooperation. Negotiate trade agreements to reduce retaliatory tariffs and stabilize global supply chains. The 90-day pause on Trump's 2025 tariffs provided a window for such negotiations, though progress remains uncertain. Conclusion. The claim that consumers always pay for tariffs oversimplifies a complex economic reality. While consumers often face higher prices due to tariffs, companies can and do absorb costs in competitive markets, high-margin industries, or through strategic supply chain adjustments. Examples like Tesla, Walmart, and Apple demonstrate that businesses employ diverse strategies, such as margin compression, supplier negotiations, and diversification, to mitigate tariff impacts. However, these strategies are not universally feasible, particularly for small businesses or industries with inelastic demand. Tariffs also disrupt supply chains, increase economic uncertainty, and provoke retaliatory measures, with long-term consequences for growth and consumer welfare. By understanding the nuanced interplay of tariffs and supply chains, policymakers and businesses can better navigate trade policy challenges, balancing domestic goals with global economic realities.